No!
Her body had been dismembered fully, and her head was never found. It's not clear how they identified her.
That's a good point. I mean, maybe she had tattoos or something?
I don't know.
I think that they correlated some missing person reports. And I don't think she had tattoos, but I think that it was a missing person report, if I remember correctly. And that's the hard part. There's so many of these people that I'm trying to, rattle through the card catalog in my brain. Mm-hmm. But I think that is how they figured out who she was.
Yeah. So then John Doe 3 was
This is a particularly disturbing one.
He was the 5th body to be found, 4th victim.
Yeah.
July 22nd of 36.
Mm-hmm.
Dismembered while alive.
Yeah, lucky guy. Ouch. I'm not sure if this killer drugged his victims or not, if they were out before he started
I don't think
working on
anybody
them.
knows anything about the victim.
Yeah.
Actually, I do know that. Are you going to talk about the medical examiners that are involved in this case, by chance?
A little.
Okay, because I can't remember the name, and maybe you do, of the second examiner that came in near the end of things, but he somehow seemed to have figured out that there was some kind of chemical in their system, or at least in one of the victims, but he couldn't figure out if that was because that person was drugged or if they were a junkie, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And the fact that that person's arms were never found to tell if they had injection points, repetitive, made it hard. So we don't know if they were being drugged or not.
Well, there's a lot of kind of stuff about the coroners and how thorough they may have been.
Or sensational they might have been.
Yeah.
The science was not as well developed.
Yeah.
Either.
And John Doe 3 is the only victim that was found on the west side of Cleveland. I guess it's minorly worth mentioning.
Okay.
John Doe number 2 was the 4th victim to be found, 5th victim to be murdered. I know it's a little wonky. It's hard with these guys.
Well, the discovery dates are the hard part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. John Doe number 2, he was the 4th discovered body, 5th victim.
And this is because of the discovery dates. Is
hard.
that why they're being ordered this way?
Yeah, it's hard. I've ordered them by murder date, but I think it's also important to mention the discovery date because John Doe number 2 was discovered before John Doe number 3, though John Doe number 3 was murdered before John Doe number 2.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? They're numbered by discovery date.
Mm-hmm. No,
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will make a Rube Goldberg machine. It's just confusing.
Yeah.
It is,
So,
but it doesn't really matter too much. But yeah.
he was decapitated while alive as well, and his head was recovered. He also had some interesting little bits about him. He was estimated to be in his mid-20s and had 6 unusual tattoos on his body. One included the names Helen and Paul, and the other had initials WCG. And his undershorts bore a laundry mark that had his initials, right? Like, in that time, you would write your initials or your name in your laundry, so that like, if you were all going in on one bulk laundry order,
Right, you could sort it back out.
Yeah, absolutely. And the initials were JD. And since they found his head, they did what's called a death mask, which I think we've talked about a little bit before.
A little bit, yeah, we've covered
where they
that.
cast the face and they recreate what it might have looked like alive, and they publicize photos of that.
Apparently
And
those things are still laying around somewhere
Yeah.
in Cleveland too.
Yeah, so despite the fact that they circulated the death mask and on his unusual tattoos, this John Doe was clearly, since he's a John Doe, was still never identified.
Well, maybe JD stood for John Doe.
Maybe it stood for John Dillinger.
Oh, there you go.
Could have been a lot of things, but they call him the tattooed man
They
because he's one of the few that has identifying marks.
So, since he was wearing his shorts, presumably he was not emasculated.
Presumably, yeah.
I don't see anything here about that.
I haven't read anything that says he was. Okay, so the next victim is Jane Doe number 6, who was the 6th murder victim. She was the 8th discovery, but they didn't identify the bodies of the previous women for the most part until later. So there are a couple that were Jane Does while the investigation was ongoing. There were likely other Jane Does happening. The Jane Does get a little out of order. Actually, they get a lot out of order. There are going to be some more Jane Does that are weirdly numbered
and it's
later.
It's again, this is based on not date of. It's the confusion is date of murder versus date of discovery.
Yeah, and the Jane Does are different than the John Does.
Oh,
okay.
And part of that has to do with the fact that a couple of the Jane Does were in fact identified.
why can't we just use the Dewey Decimal System?
Yeah,
I
really, right?
Give him a number.
So this one actually is very interesting. She was the only black victim. She was decapitated, but she was also missing a rib.
Yeah, that's a little bit of a
And her
drug,
head
yeah.
was discovered, and they thought perhaps that they had identified her as a woman named Rose Wallace. Dental work, the tooth records, which is what dental work means, was a pretty close match. The police said that her son was there.
That's sad.
But
Did they actually show him the head? I'm trying to think of what that would be like.
I
Look
suspect.
at mom's severed head.
Yeah,
Ugh.
I suspect they did a death mask.
Well, hopefully they did.
You know?
Yeah.
But
Well, but she'd been dead for a long
she'd
time.
been
been
dead for a year
right?
when they found her. And the dentist who carried out her dental work, who could look at it and be like, yes, that's my handiwork and she was my patient, died years before. So the police never officially identified her as Rose Wallace, despite
So that's why there's no
lots
official.
of stuff. And additionally, her body had been estimated to have been dead for a year, but Rose Wallace had only been reported missing for 10 months.
That's not a big problem.
It's a
for me.
weird. Well, it's
Because
just
I mean, a year. Come on, that's a rounding thing. It's like 10 months.
Oh,
maybe,
absolutely,
so
yeah,
it's
and
like,
especially in this climate with all this
Totally.
stuff happening, who
it
knows?
totally could have been her.
So it's likely that Jane Doe was in fact Rose Wallace, but
We don't know
actually
for sure.
Yeah. Next is John Doe 4.
No, another John Doe.
He was the 7th murder victim, 6th body to be found, and only half of his torso was found. Nothing below the hips.
No head.
No head.
Yeah.
So he did not have great legs.
Maybe he had such great legs that the murderer had to keep them.
Maybe.
Yeah. He almost.
It's a trophy.
Yeah.
Yeah. You almost wonder if he took some of these parts back to wherever and reassembled them into this sort of
Frankenstein.
Yeah, Frankenstein kind of thing.
Yeah.
Maybe some sort of weird.
Stop!
Possible.
No,
creepy hobby.
stop!
Stop,
Because
stop.
that's a really disturbing
Yeah.
Frankenstein trophy wall thing.
Yeah.
We're moving forward.
Oh yeah. It is Halloween. Hey.
Jane Doe number 5.
Still grosses me out.
Yeah, it's a little gross. Yeah.
8th victim, 7th body to be found, was found in the same spot that the Lady of the Lake was found.
And this is like a year after the Lady of or 2 years.
2
2 years later.
Yeah, and her head was never found. John Doe number 7, kind of typical body found, no head, so they couldn't identify him. He was 9th murder victim and also the 9th found.
And they pulled him out of the river.
Pulled him out of the river.
Now that's one of the things we haven't really talked about and I think maybe is a little important for people to know. Some of these bodies are found in fields. Some are found on the banks of the river. Some, because they're found on the banks of the river, they find some of the other body parts because they're dredging them out of the river. But it's really inconsistent as to where they're showing up. I mean, it's kind of willy-nilly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But actually,
All on the east side.
If you're the killer, you don't want to be want to be totally consistent because that's a way to catch you.
Well, it worked for
Yeah.
Dexter.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay,
He's a TV
next
star.
one is John Doe 10, who was found at the same time as Jane Doe 9. He was the 10th victim, 12th found. Jane Doe 9 was the 11th victim, 11th found. He was a decapitated body. His head was found in a can close by. She was a decapitated female body. Her head was also found.
Yeah. Now let's see. He was.
They were found in the lakeshore dump.
Found in the dump. Okay.
And it's believed they weren't actually murdered at the same time, though. I think again this goes back
Oh
to
yeah, I'm
weird
sorry.
places where they're found. Is it like the murder or whoever the perpetrator is dumps 2 bodies in one place, but there's months apart between the killings.
Yeah, so John Doe 10 was estimated to have died 7 to 9 months prior to his discovery, and Jane Doe 9 was 4 to 6 months. So within the span of a couple months, this person dumped 2 decapitated bodies
at the same spot. But since it hadn't hit the news that the John Doe X or John Doe 10 had been found, then he probably realized that was a safe place to go back to.
Well, yeah, and the thing is, it's not as if the bodies were laid on top of each other. I mean, it was a dump.
Yeah.
Walked into a dump. I know that some of these, it was as, they go to extents of roll them into a rug and then roll that into a quilt and then throw them in the dump. I mean, it wasn't like these bodies were just cast out and blatantly naked human being parts and pieces laying around for a lot of times. Some of them are rolled up and hidden in things like the can that you talked about that the head was in. So whoever is doing this, and I want to say guy just because the violent nature of it, but the person that's doing this is attempting to disguise what they're doing and hiding the remains.
Yeah.
Whether it be a poor job of rolling it in the rug or tossing it in the river, they're still trying to hide them. It's not as if they're just laying on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
So,
and by the way, at the dump, did they like go through all the piles of trash out there and see if there were any more bodies?
I have no idea.
I
believe
that's how they found the second victim.
Oh, okay. You would think that they would.
The searches were very extensive after every single one of the findings.
I imagine they poured a lot of resources into this one.
Yeah. And the last victim, last canonical victim is what they're calling them. She's the 12th victim, the 10th body to be discovered, Jane Doe 8. She was found in April of 1938. And on that day, only the lower leg, one lower leg, so like her thigh, or her calf, was found. And a month later, a human thigh was discovered floating in the river west of a bridge in Cleveland. Police officers, of course, decided, we better search. And they found a burlap sack containing a headless torso cut in half, another thigh, and a left foot, all belonging to the same body. And the head and the rest of the body were never found. But this is the victim that Steve was talking about a little bit with the second coroner who's kind of involved in this case. He found drugs in her system. And again, there's not a whole mess of information about
But we don't really know.
We don't totally know. And this guy, we will probably talk about a little bit later, was like there was a lot of crime happening in Cleveland at the time, and he was like getting pretty famous on like testifying and these like really high profile cases. And so how much he just sensationalized it and said, there were drugs in her system. How much of it was true, it's hard to tell.
So when you find a body that's been dismembered, there's obviously not going to be any blood left. It's all going to run out. How do you test for drugs in a dismembered body?
I think it depends on when they were dismembered. This is so gross. It doesn't, I think that blood kind of thickens and settles, and if it's not a fresh body.
Well, no. The way I understand it, and I would think about it, is blood is the circulatory system that pushes the drug through your body. But your body, the tissues in locations, has to absorb that drug. So it's absorbed into the tissue of, let's say, your liver or your brain or, whatever organ it might be. So if the blood is all gone, the remnants or the traces of that should still be in the organs because they've absorbed whatever chemical that is or whatever drug that is, regardless of the presence of blood. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like,
I see what you're saying.
It's like ink and water on paper. I've got ink and I mix water with it and I drip it on paper. The the water evaporates, but I've still got remnants of ink on that piece of paper because the ink has been absorbed by the paper, though the water is no longer present.
But I think that it really seems likely to me that the killer probably drugged all of his victims. Because otherwise overpowering somebody and decapitating them, especially a man, while still alive, well, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
Well, and not everything lasts in the system. That's one of the things I questioned about the drugs in the system, is a lot of things don't last. They break down.
Yeah, they do.
Regardless of being alive or not, the compounds just break down.
And also, I think it's worth mentioning that these were unidentified people because, however horrible this sounds, by and large, people didn't care about them. I mean, like, if you've got...
We're alone in the world.
Yeah, if you've got a family who really cares about you, they're going to be really litigious and, like, really search out anybody that might be you.
Yeah, kind of like Dorothy Arnold's family.
Right.
But if you're like a prostitute or a homeless guy, nobody cares.
I mean, or maybe one person does, but they don't know how to, like, really explore that, or for whatever reason. I don't think that we can really with any kind of certainty say these people weren't doing drugs like that just on their own, like voluntarily putting those drugs in their body.
Well, and
the 30s were a weird time for drugs.
I'm not honest. Well, and what I was going to say is I'm not casting any negative on any of the victims.
Right.
But if you're in what equates to a Skid Row situation, and you're turning to alcohol and drugs to make the days go by and to make them easier, you're going to do whatever alleviates your pain. So, it's quite likely that all of these people were doing drugs of some sort, whether it was what was administered to them by our killer, or if they just went down and they found this new drug that's called heroin, because heroin had just come out, and I'm going to try this heroin thing, and wow, I really feel better about myself.
Yeah, fun stuff I hear. I've never tried it myself, so I can't really say.
I don't know that it's really actually fun stuff based on the stories that we've heard. So.
I hear it's fun to start out with, but after that it kind of goes downhill. But
so there are a number of outliers, or like maybe other victims.
Oh yes, I love this connection.
Yeah, it's interesting. So on July 1st of 1936, a headless, unidentified male was found in a boxcar in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. Then 3 headless victims were found in boxcars near McKees Rock, Pennsylvania, in May of 1940. They all kind of had similar injuries as those that were attributed to the Cleveland killer or the Kingsbury Run killer, murderer. Lots of dismembered bodies were found in the swamps near Newcastle, Pennsylvania, between the years of 1921 and 1934, and then again between 1939 and 1942.
Now that's interesting.
Yep.
That's very interesting.
And then in September of 1940, an article in the Newcastle News refers to this killer as the Murder Swamp Killer, which is the worst name I've ever heard. Ever.
Not very creative.
Yeah.
And credits him with, I think it was 17 murders in Newcastle over the years.
Wow.
The victims were like, what was inflicted on them was almost identical to what was going on in Cleveland's Kingsbury Run, which conveniently were connected directly by a Baltimore and Ohio Railroad line, which, as you will remember, runs right through Kingsbury Run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But apparently, the Cleveland detective Peter Merlo went and...
I think it's
sounds right.
Yeah, you said Merlo, yeah.
Sorry.
He's not a wine.
He was pretty sure that the Newcastle murders were, in fact, the work of the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run.
Mm-hmm. But these were just headless corpses, right?
It's hard. I couldn't find a whole lot of information. Some of them, I think, were headless corpses. I think a lot of them were otherwise dismembered as well. Mm-hmm. The railroad in question here ran twice a day, every day, between the two cities. And in fact, how did we decide that we're saying that name?
Murillo.
Yeah. Rode that train undercover like all the time to try and identify the killer, and he never could. And
maybe he was the killer.
Yes, it's possible actually. For all we know. And then in July of 1950, the body of a 41-year-old man named Robert Robertson was found in a business in Cleveland, and police said that he had been dead for like 6 to 8 weeks, but he had been intentionally decapitated, and apparently he seemed to kind of fit the profile of the other victims. He was estranged from his family, he had an arrest record, he had a drinking problem, he was kind of on the fringes of society, and the police decided to not link it to the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run.
Well, after
murders.
that much time.
It was 20 years
or 10
of
years.
essential. Well, it was 20 years. Oh, yeah, I guess 10 years, 12
years.
12 years.
Long enough they don't want to dredge up that
More than
old
a
case that they
decade.
couldn't figure out.
Right.
And get the egg back on their
Exactly.
face.
Yeah, and of
So-
course, not everybody who gets their head chopped off is necessarily related to this thing. I mean, it does happen.
Right,
It's even
but
happening today.
But I think that it is odd that, and worth note, I guess, since I did note it, that in Baltimore, just a boxcar hop away, a bunch of people around that time were also showing up, decapitated or otherwise dismembered. So suspects. This is where we get even more frustrated, right? Like, not only can we not identify most of these bodies, and like we don't have a whole lot of information, but also there's like 2 suspects.
This is the part of the story that infuriates me.
Yeah.
I know. Apparently, they had like a lot of suspects. They hold a lot of people in for questioning.
Yeah, well, there's only 2 like viable.
But they probably beat the crap out of a hell of a lot of people trying to get a confession out of them. But
All right.
Let's just say that police interrogative techniques at the time
We're not.
we're a little more forceful.
were not in line with the Geneva Convention.
Yeah. All right. So the first one is X, or Frank Dolezal. How would you say that?
I would say Dolezal. Dolezal.
So in January of 1939, the Cleveland Press got a letter from a man who claimed to be the killer and identified himself as X. He said that he was in California and that he had been killing people for medical experiments, not experiences. And he actually referred to the bodies as, quote, laboratory guinea pigs, unquote. And there were apparently no clues, but somehow the police, I don't totally know how, it's super unclear, but somehow the police linked this to Frank, whatever his last name is.
Dolezal.
Yeah. And he was a 52-year-old Slavic immigrant. So on August 24th of 1939, Frank was arrested as a suspect in Florence's murder. You remember she was like victim number 3?
3, yeah.
Yeah. And